Mr. McCarthy is very generous and kind enough to have some questions from the floor. So we have got about 10 minutes. Please keep your question as short as possible and identify yourself. And Lini will run to you when she sees your hand up.
Thank you, John. You might have known I'd have something to say about this. 10 years ago, when I was just about to leave Foreign Affairs, I went and said to them, I want to do a research project for you on how Australia is regarded in Asian countries. And they said, why do you want to know that? And I said, because I think it's important. And they said, we can find that out really easily. I said, how? Because I was trying to work out how to find it out myself. This was in the days before all those wonderful polls online that you're talking about. And they said, we can just send a cable to all posts and ask the ambassadors how Australia is regarded in their countries. And at that point I walked out, went over to ANU, did a PhD and wrote a book on it. That came out in 2003. Still nothing's been done. And my hope is that perhaps there'll be opportunity for collaboration because it's my next project too. Thank you.
Thank you, Alison. Yeah.
Could you, my question is, do you think Foreign Affairs is interested yet?
Actually, I think it's increasingly interested in it. I think the Present Secretary is interested in it. He's done more of that sort of work than others have. And he certainly demonstrated an interest to me. I think probably more resources, and this is always a difficult question for Foreign Affairs because they're very short, genuinely very short on resources. I think, you know, they do need more resources, and I think they will do the work if they get those resources. Unfortunately, people have never made their careers on this sort of issue in any foreign service. We're not alone in this at all. I mean, people want to get into the hard economic work or the hard strategic security work, so, you know, you have to establish from the government down that this is a priority, and then I think you will get Foreign Affairs delivering. There's quite a lot of interest in these issues in DFAT, so I don't think that's the problem. It's really the government saying, look, we've really got to do some very solid work on this. But what I would stress with this sort of work is that it is very important for assertions to be backed up by data. And that's why polling and using a number of different polls is really, I think, quite important, because you can't bring a case based on what your gut tells you. You've got to be able to support it. The second point I'd make about public diplomacy is, and this has been one of the issues with it all along, it's very hard to measure its effect. And so the British in particular have done some work on how you measure the impact of public diplomacy. And we need to do a lot more on that. The ABC are trying to work to get sort of results on what the impact is. But again, it's part of the polling coin, in the sense that on the other side of the coin from polling backs up assertions, but then when you put programs in to handle your public diplomacy priorities, you have to have ways of assessing whether or not these were successful. And so a lot of very solid, rigorous work has to go into this exercise.
Please identify yourself.
Thank you, sir, for your very insightful keynote address. My name is Danny. I'm from the Monash Asia Institute, and I got a quick question about public diplomacy. I think public diplomacy is very important, but to what extent now do you think that the students that study in Australia are the best public diplomats for Australia? Because a lot of them do come to Australia to study. In this room, I believe that there's a lot of international students here doing their postgrad studies. And I'm quite skeptical about a lot of us who actually had an experience, a good sense of what's Australia about during our studies. And do you think the Australian government should improve on this, and how could
Should
they
improve on what? I'm sorry.
improve on the Australian experience of international students? For example, if they come here to study, whether they're getting the right experience, they're getting the right exposure, or even they are getting the right feel about what Australia is about to become a very good public diplomat. Thank you.
Yeah, look, again, what I'm about to say is impressionistic. I haven't got data to support this. My sense is that with a lot of foreign students who come to Australia, they have a good experience. They certainly should have a good experience. They go to good universities and good vocational training institutes in a lot of cases. My sense is that there have been, and I don't think I'm discovering the wheel when I say this. This has come out very much in the last year or 18 months. There have been massive shortcomings in the way we've handled education policy for students coming in for vocational training, particularly with the prospect of permanent residence at the end. I mean, these students have come in, I think, in good faith, and they've come in with the intention of migrating to Australia. But clearly the educational experience as such has really been appallingly bad in a number of cases, and there's a huge amount of repair work to be done. But for those students who come down and go to an Australian university or a good vocational training institute, the experience should be fairly positive. I mean, I think one can put the onus on the government to some degree to help as much as it can with counselling services, etc., etc. But the onus, I think, is primarily on the institution. It has to be. So can we do a better job? Probably we can, and we should. But I'm not sure that the government can do that much other than set the policy parameters in a way which will encourage students to come down for the right reason and go to the right institutions.
So, thank you very much for a most interesting talk. Could you address your concerns about Indian perceptions of Australia? On the basis of your experience, what should Australia be doing in terms of international best practice in public diplomacy to address the adverse perceptions in India of Australia?
Okay, the impact. It's a very interesting and complex subject. The impact has been devastatingly serious at a public level. I don't think even now that is appreciated in Australia. I'd also say, though, at a government level, there has been a real effort by the Indian government to manage the issue and to keep the overall relationship on an even keel. And I think we have to pay due respect to what the Indian government has done in that regard. But the impact on two occasions broadly, one when I was still there, and this was about June last year, the second one in January, February this year, when a series of incidents, in each case, the second instance involving a murder, when a series of incidents received literally saturation television coverage in India on the 24-hour news channels. During the period I was there, for example, it pretty well led the news for about 2 weeks, every hour on the hour. And it pushed to the second and third items other massively newsworthy issues, such as, for example, major changes in the government. It was second item up. It was what was happening out of Melbourne in particular that was leading the news item. So let's not underestimate the impact. It was very serious. And it came from a combination of factors, policies both at a federal and state level all over the country, involving several ministries, nobody putting this issue of, are we handling student policy right, to the top of their intro. It was always a second or third tier issue. And we ended up with a major problem. And all you can ask is that governments do better next time and that embassies do better. We saw problems coming down the line, by the way, in New Delhi. We didn't see them breaking out in quite the way that they broke out, particularly in Melbourne, but also in other cities. But we saw the way the immigration policy was going, students coming down, then going for permanent residence, students going down who didn't speak enough English, all this. We saw it as ending in tears. We didn't foresee quite how it did end. But anyway, it's dramatically serious. How do we repair it? Well, first of all, we've got to repair it on the ground. And you may be aware there are changes in student policy which, in effect, de-link coming in as a student from permanent residence, or from automaticity, or almost automaticity of permanent residence. Now, this is going to be a difficult couple of years to ride in student policy. I think people know that. And I'm not sure that, I don't want to make a comment on whether we're going the right way or the wrong way. You can argue that we need more of more alternatives for students who are already in Australia than going into another course, receiving sponsorship from an employer, or going back to India, because going back to India without a degree is not an option for them. Very difficult. So the policy itself is going to count in terms of the way we handle public diplomacy. But equally, I think there is a massive job over 5 years, and we're essentially this is in place, of making clear to Indians that Australia shouldn't be defined by student policy, that there are far more aspects to this country. None of that is misleading, it's just really telling the truth. But that is bringing people down here, sending people up to India and so on. There's a whole suite of avenues that we're adopting.
One last question.
Ambassador David Hill from the Asia Research Centre at Murdoch University. With regard to your comments on the effectiveness, or perhaps the ineffectiveness, of our public diplomacy policies in Indonesia specifically, would you agree that the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade Travel Advisory is a major impediment, specifically in educational and community connections with Indonesia? And if so, what kind of argument might be effective in pressing the government for a review of that travel advisory and a more nuanced assessment of risk in Indonesia?
Yeah. Look, when I talk about failure of public diplomacy, what I'm not saying, I don't want to suggest that our current efforts are bad. It's merely that we need more of it. I have no complaints about the way DFAT does its job or anybody else does its job. It's simply that a lot more needs to be done. It has to be play a much greater part in our overall outlook. The question of, where we have problems with Indonesia, you've got to bear in mind a lot of it's reflected in the reality. Public diplomacy can only impact on it a little bit, You can't get around a thing like a Timor crisis. You just can't. You've got it. And you have to sort of ride it as best you can. But what you say about the travel advisories, look, this is a constant dilemma in DFAT. The issue is this, that so much stress is put on by the Australian community as a whole on consular assistance, that the government just has to be very careful all the time in making sure that its warnings are sufficiently clear and spell out the risks sufficiently, for people not to turn around when they've gone into a country and they've had something terrible happen and say, look, we were never warned about this. This is the problem. Now, I think it does need to be more nuanced. I think there are a whole host of areas we have to look at, and this thing is constantly under review. But I think what you will find is that the problems that arise through insufficient warning are so considerable that ministers are very, very cautious about downgrading a warning for a country, because then something happens and immediately the government's blamed. That's what it's about. But I think you're right. I would like it very much to be more nuanced.